So let's see if I can do this all in one video here. This is my debrief of the 2019 Vintage Off-Road Nationals and of all the cars that I ran. Let's start with the Traxxas Rad 2. I ran that in the Classic class. Overall the car was okay. It did take a lot of effort to get it to corner as sharply as I would like. So, you know, the front end on that car is fairly light, so it did have a fair amount of push. I had to do a lot of things with like lifting the rear, making the rear ride height higher than the front, and, you know, running like really high camber gain, low roll center at the front in particular, you know, trying to reduce the rear toe angle. I think the only thing that I didn't do that I probably should have, that would have helped a bit more, is to increase the rear kick-up angle, the rear anti-squat angle. That would have helped the rear rotate a little more. But actually, I had a fair amount of rear rotation by lifting the rear ride height more. The real problem was just in the front, like getting low speed steering. So having the right tires certainly helps. Initially, in the open practice session on Friday, I ran fresh M4 transistors up front, and those actually worked okay because at that time the track was still a little damp, and so you know, the dirt was, let's say, comparatively fluffy as far as hard packed surfaces go. So the transistors worked really well. But then once we got into qualifying on Saturday, the track started drying up, and the transistors didn't work as well, and so I had to go to ghosted electrons up front. Those worked a lot better, but still, you know, the car was kind of pushing a bit. I really had to try hard to, you know, get it to corner as quickly as I would have wanted. Other than that, you know, it did fare okay. You know, I ended up qualifying second, and some of that was because of, you know, throwaways during qualifying, bad traffic, and so forth. Some of it was because the handout motor that we got, the sport-tuned Tamiya handout motors, it worked fine in the first two qualifying rounds, and then around the middle of the third round, I started losing punch. And I thought that was because maybe my battery voltage was dropping a little low, maybe I forgot to recharge the battery or something. And I came to find out later in the main that the motor just died. Like, I started the main and I made it maybe a few laps and the motor just completely died. So if I didn't have that problem with the motor in the third qualifier, I might have gotten a little bit closer to TQ. I was still a few seconds off, but maybe I would have gotten, you know, closer. So part of that was because I ran, you know, really high gearing, or rather really low gear ratio on the motor, as low as I could go, 35 tooth pinion, and I think it's a 78 tooth spur. The first two rounds I didn't kill the motor though, and I think that's because the slipper clutch was a little on the loose side. So I noticed the slipper slipping a lot in the second round of qualifying, and then I tried to tighten the slipper to get more punch coming out of corners, and that certainly helped in the third round. But maybe because I tightened the slipper, anytime I landed a jump, you know, that's going to put more load on the motor, and you get this current spike that is induced in the system, and so then ends up heating up the motor more. So the motor pulled off at about 170 degrees after the third round of qualifiers. I don't think it was quite that hot in the first two rounds. So maybe if I ran the slipper a little bit looser, then I wouldn't have burned out the motor. But that kind of shows you a little bit about how finicky that motor is. That sport-tuned motor is rather temperature sensitive, and I wasn't the only one who burned out my motor in that particular class. There were at least two other drivers who also burnt out their handout sport-tuned motors. So you got to be really careful with thermal management on that motor. And by the way, I do have a heatsink on there, so, you know, it's not like I was you know, not trying to take care of heat. So kind of unfortunate. I could have had a really nice race with the TQ guy. I know him from last year's race. He's very fast, and that would have been a good race, but again, motor burnt out. Going forward, would I want to run this car again next time? That's the key question. Maybe, Certainly, my Tamiya Dirt Thrasher is a much better car. It corners a lot better. It's certainly faster. It doesn't run nearly as hot either. So overall, I think I would tend towards the Dirt Thrasher to run it in classic class. It's just easier to put in fast laps and not have to worry so much about reliability. So I'm leaning towards that right now. You know, maybe next time I could bring this again and try another shot at it if I can think of a few more setup tricks, and maybe go down a few teeth on the pinion and be a little bit more sensitive on the slipper clutch. But it's a real fine line there with this car to try to get it to not overheat and be fast and corner fast. So you know, it's okay. It's okay. But probably the Dirt Thrasher's certainly. I would probably go with the Dirt Thrasher next time. Okay, for Stadium Truck, I spent actually most of my time during Friday open practice trying to figure out which of these two trucks I was going to run. And between them, I spent more time on the mid-motor truck because even though I thought I had resolved the spur gear grinding issue that I talked about in the previous video, it turns out that was not the case. It showed up again on Friday open practice. So I brought the truck out, I go down the straight, and all of a sudden I just blasted a spur gear. So okay, I put that aside, take out the Pro XRT, and I blasted another spur gear. So then I had to go and, you know, replace the spur gear on this one, and that ended up being perfectly fine. There was no issue. I think I just had some mesh issue on that, which I resolved. And then on this one, ultimately I ended up having to just reduce the throttle endpoint. There was nothing I could do within the time that I had to allow me to run full throttle with all the boost that I had without the motor shaft getting a little bit wobbly, and that ended up, you know, as I described in a previous video, changing the mesh between the spur and the pinion and then just grinding the spur. So I basically had to run this truck at about 75% endpoint on the throttle. And that was problem number one. Problem number two is I couldn't get it to a low enough ride height, so I still have to work on that, figuring out how to get it to ride at about, say, a 27 millimeter ride height, which is where I can get the Pro XRT. On this, the lowest I can go is around like 30 or 33 millimeters, something around there. So the problem's really at the rear, with the rear ride height. But anyway, the truck felt okay during open practice. The Pro XRT, when I took that out on M4 ions with open cell inserts in open practice, it felt freaking amazing. Now, granted, open practice is with a damper track, and by the time Sunday rolls around, which is when they run Stadium Truck, the track is much drier, it's much higher grip. But the Pro XRT felt so good that I decided to just go with that for the weekend and, you know, put the mid-motor truck aside, at least this time. On Sunday, I found myself having more issues with the Pro XRT. It didn't feel quite as easy to drive quickly as it did on Friday. So I had to play around with tires a little bit. I tried a few things with the front shock angle because the front was pushing. But ultimately, I ended up with this setup that I previously had on Friday, and then just using primes in the rear and electrons up front that seemed to give me the best combination of rear grip and front grip. But the truck did still push a bit. I still have to work a little bit on the front shock setting, maybe go to a slightly thicker oil, thicker spring, or a stiffer spring. But otherwise, you know, it felt pretty good. I qualified 7th, finished 4th in the A main for that. The same finishing position, I think, is what I got with my RC10 GTE last year. So, you know, it's a good truck. I like it a lot. Would I run it again next time? That's, again, the key question here. This one's a lot harder to answer because I basically have a choice between the Pro XRT, this Outlaw Rampage Pro E, if I can figure out some setup tricks with this, my GTE, which is, you know, tried and true, it's well tested, it's a great truck, and my RC10T, which isn't on the shelf here, it's in a box. My RC10T, when I ran that in previous years, it was awesome. My GTE is, you know, I have a lot of videos on that. It's a very good truck. So, you know, part of me is thinking maybe I would go back to, you know, running Associated for the truck because, you know, I haven't run those in a while. and I have maybe a better sense of how to be quick with those than with these two. The other part of me is thinking I want to, put more time into these, and really sort of focus on one of these trucks and get them to a better position in later events. So that's kind of where I am, excuse me, with Stadium Truck right now. For the four-wheel drive buggies, I'll start with the Inferno 10E. This, I did have to make some setup changes to this over the weekend. Basically, it did have quite a bit of bump steer the way I had it originally set up, and that turned out to be a problem with straight line stability. It usually is a problem with straight line stability. The front stretch, if you want to call it that, in the layout as it was, is actually a little bumpy, and that tended to upset the car a bit, especially at the rear. It caused the rear to really kick up, and you'll see that a few times if you watch the video. You'll see it with this car, and also I think with the Laser. But also with the bump steer in there, the car just tended to dart off in different directions. So I took that out. I also found that I had to run the original the Kyosho ZX5 rims, which have the little offset there in the disc. It's not a flush disc, it's an offset rim. So that makes the front a little bit wider. It also makes the rim itself a little bit narrower, so you can see the tire profile there is a bit rounded at the top. If you run the ZX6 rim, it's actually a wider rim, and it's a zero offset, so it makes the front a little bit narrower, and the tire itself is wider, so the tire profile is flatter at the top. So that basically gives you on the ZX6 wheel more front grip, and with a narrower front. So the front on this car has a ton of steering. So even though I tried to tune that out a bit by reducing the rear camber gain, because I don't have many options on the front, and basically running a treaded front tire in addition to a slick rear tire, because again on Sunday when we were running this, the grip level was pretty high, it was still a little twitchy. I also ran negative 50% exponential on the steering to try to calm the steering down on initial input. That helped a little bit. But ultimately running the ZX5 rims with, these are M4 transistors, this helps a fair amount. So you combine this with the 8mm wide wheel hex with the LA59 hubs to widen the front, basically make the front as wide as possible between the rims and the wheel hexes and the front caster blocks. That made the car, at least for my driving style, the most drivable. I TQ'd round 1 of qualifying with this, and then in rounds 2 and 3, the Mark Westerfield, who is a good friend of mine, and he showed up with his XX4. Whenever he shows up with his XX4, it's basically game over for everybody. He easily outpaced me in rounds 2 and 3. In the middle of round 2, I started to hear what sounded like some grinding of gears on the car, and I wasn't quite sure where it came from. So I just tried to go easy on the car, and then in round 3 it became more apparent. So clearly something was wrong. I looked at the car, and there was a bunch of diff oil coming out of the back. So basically what happened was the rear diff was starting to separate between the actual bevel gear and the diff housing. And if you go way, way back and you look at my build video for this, I talk about how to actually make this a sealed gear diff. I'm only able to basically use 2 of the 4 screws you would normally use to close the diff up. And those screws started to back out. I don't know if they were stripping on the actual housing or not, but they backed out, and the diff was starting to come apart, and all the oil leaked out. And as that diff comes apart, I notice this particularly on braking. If I apply heavy brakes, the internal gears start grinding. So I took the whole thing apart, put oil back in the gear, in the gear diff, put the diff back together, put everything back together, had it ready for the main, and I thought I had it fixed. And then when the main happened, sure enough, I ran into the same problem. So I think some of the screw holes on that diff housing might be stripped. So I have to go and repair that. But I ended up finishing first in the four-wheel drive A main because I qualified third, but I got the whole shot on second place at the start of the race because it was a staggered grid, and first and third place were on the inside line. And then after the first lap, Mark actually broke out. So I inherited first place by the end of the first lap. And then from there, I just had to nurse the car to the finish line because, within a few laps, I noticed this grinding happening. And, I didn't want to break out. So I just had to really, kind of drive easy. Like, I couldn't put in hard laps or super fast laps. I knew I had a good gap to second and third place. They were fighting for position anyway. So, a lot of the approaches to corners that I otherwise would have taken at full throttle with hard brake, I had to kind of like coast into them and then rely on the sharp steering to get me around the corner at an otherwise higher entry speed. But this car managed it well. Overall, I think that it's an incredibly good handling car. With a little bit of work on the rear diff in particular, I think this would have fared even better. In terms of jumping, the YZ10s and the Cat 2000s and the XX4s are better jumpers. This isn't a bad jumper by any means. It's just those cars are better jumpers. On balance, I think it's really quite good. The only real fault that I could give it, if any, is the lack of a slipper clutch. This does have a center diff, but I had to lock the center diff because I couldn't find a way to make it sealed and oil filled. If I could find a way around that, then that could basically act as something of a slipper clutch and help me save the rear diff in particular on heavy braking. But, I really like this car. It's actually a really good car. But next time around, I am inclined to run my Yokomo YZ10 because, I have a YZ10 that I have in mind to use, a 95 YZ10 that I haven't run yet at Vonats, and I'd really like to run that. I'm very familiar with my Yokomos, so I know how to set them up. I know how they feel to drive. They do jump better than this car. So, maybe I'll give this one another shot, but right now I'm heavily leaning towards my YZ10 for the four-wheel drive class. For the classic four-wheel drive class, the Laser ZX-RR, the steering characteristics are very similar to the Inferno 10E, which kind of makes sense because they have the same suspension arms, the same caster blocks, the same steering knuckles. A lot of the stuff's the same there at the front. This car was much more reliable than this car, that's for sure. Has a slipper clutch, it has ball diff, so there's no oil that's going to leak out all over the place. This held together really well. I actually didn't have to make any changes to this car other than lightening the rear shock oil to, I think, 27.5 weight. Otherwise, my baseline setup for this was a really good guess. I kind of lucked out there. It drove fantastic. It corners great. I really like how sharp the cornering is on these cars. If you can manage it, it's actually really, really helpful, and it allows you to really catch up, to other cars if you're trying to, make up time. Like, you really notice yourself gaining time on competitors going into corners and around corners with these cars. It's really incredible. The jumping performance, again, it's so-so, but again, this is classic four-wheel drive, so this car would be competing against Kyosho Optima Mids, Yokomo 870s, Yokomo Works, theoretically the Cat 2000, which is probably the best jumper among them. But, it's a good car. I could actually put in consistently faster lap times with this car than with that car. But again, part of that was because of the drivetrain issue I had with that. If that drivetrain stayed together during the main, this would have been seriously quick. So would I run this again next time? It's tempting, but I'm thinking of going with a slightly different theme next time, right? If I'm going to run a Yokomo for four-wheel drive buggy, then I'd like to run my Yokomo 93 Works for classic four-wheel drive buggy, because I did make setup changes to that car that I think would make it better than when I ran it last year. So I would like to give that another chance. I'm very pleased that I was able to TQ and win with this car, so it's basically proven itself. So, in a way I'm thinking, let me move on to perfecting the 93 Works, and, so that I'm at least happy with that before I can set that Yokomo aside and move on to something else. So for these two, I'm pretty sure next time I go to Vonats, it'll be Yokomos for both classes. For two-wheel buggy, the Rampage Pro E, this car has been fantastic all weekend. I really didn't have to change a whole lot. I mean, I just played a little bit with the rear roll center and camber gain until I got the car kind of settled in the way I wanted. Everything else I kept the same. The springs, the shock angles, the oils, everything exactly the same. The only things that I changed throughout the weekend were the tires. So on Friday I used electrons because, open practice again, track was damp, you need treaded tires. And then when Sunday rolled around, when we ran the race for this, I used M4 inversions, and those worked really well. I think they worked better than primes because even though the track was very high grip, it's still a little bit dusty offline. So for me personally, I'm better off using something like an inversion than a prime, which is more like a pure slick. By the way, for the laser, I ran M4 electrons because that was on Saturday. And on Saturday, the track wasn't quite fully dried out yet. So the electrons actually worked just fine. So would I run this again next time? That's hard to say. Because I did actually do so well with this car. I ended up qualifying second in two-wheel drive buggy. And I ended up finishing second, which I'm really, really pleased with. Because the guy who finished first was seriously quick. Like, there was no way I was going to catch him. He's a local racer to that track, and his car was just insane. So the fact that I could finish second with this car, especially since the last time I raced on dirt was a year ago at this exact event, I think really says a lot about how great this car is. So I'm really pleased with it. I would love to bring it back again the next time I go to Vonats. Because it's such a good car and I could just put it down on the track. I know it's going to work because, the car is proven, the setup's proven, it's just fantastic. I've been sort of toying with the idea of bringing back one of the RC10s that I used to run at Walkit a few years ago that has the RPM Worlds conversion on it. That would take some effort because I'd have to set it up for a higher grip track that they have at RC Excitement. So if I did bring that car, it would take a little bit of work, maybe 1 or 2 years to really get it to a competitive place, let's say. I have actually 2 years to think about what roster I'm going to run next year for everything because, I do have another baby coming in December, and that's going to basically throw all my racing into the garbage for the next year, right? The baby's going to be 9 months old, 10 months old by the time Vonats comes around next year. Baby won't be old enough basically for me to leave that and my toddler son with my wife for a whole weekend while I go race toy cars. So next year I very likely won't be able to go. So I have at least 2 years to figure out what I'm going to run for Vonats next time I go. Presently I'm thinking for two-wheel buggy, either this Rampage Pro E or I call it my orange RC10, the one with the RPM Worlds conversion, one of those. For four-wheel buggy, the Yokomos. For classic, the Tamiya Dirt Thrasher. And for stadium truck, that's much more open, either of these two, or maybe my RC10 GTE. We'll see. So that's kind of it. I know this was kind of a long video, but I wanted to make sure I got through the main points on each of these cars. They were all, great in their own way. I had a fantastic time at the event, obviously. This is, my favorite race of the year. And let's see, anything else to point out? Actually, you know what? For two-wheel drive buggy, I am working on a Pro X build. So that's another option for me. I can either run this or Kyosho Pro X rear motor or an RC10. So there's going to be a whole lot for me to think about over the next 2 years about what to run. So in the meantime, thanks for watching.